Hi Gordon. Today we're going to adjust the valves on a 300D turbo. The procedure on the 300D turbo would be the same as on a 300D or a 240D. All of the process is the same on all the diesel engines. We'll look at the specs in a minute, but first let's look at the tools we might need. The only thing that's perhaps of any consequence that you might not have in a normal garage are valve adjusting wrenches. You see that they've got a funny little bend to them, and you can get these out of a number of catalogs. These happen to be a German model. The size is a 14 millimeter, but you see they're bent at just the right angle to get in there and adjust those nuts, and that'll become obvious once we get under the hood. The rest of the tools are fairly straightforward. We need a feeler gauge to check the valve adjustments, and we need just some socket arrangements to take off some nuts and bolts. There's some 10 millimeter. There's a 10 millimeter to take off the air cleaner, and there's a 14 millimeter to take off the 4 valve cover nuts. I need a pair of needle nose to take a couple of clips off, and a screwdriver to pop loose some of the linkage. And then of course I need a new valve cover gasket. The reason I always use a new one is because the old ones, after they've been on there for a while, they get really hard, and they're not soft and pliable, and they don't seal real well. So when I do the valves, I change that gasket. And then what I've got is a little jumper switch so I can bump the engine over. I'm going to need to rotate the engine to get the valves off center, to get them off the high lobe point. So I need to make that connection, and I think those are all the tools that I'll need. Now if we go over here and look, I've written on the wall the spec on this particular engine. You see, I've drawn a diagram of the valves when we get to them. This is the front of the engine on this side. This is the head from a top view. So the exhaust valve, and then there are 2 intakes, and then 2 exhaust, 2 intakes, 2 exhaust, and an intake. So a 5-cylinder engine, it's got 10 valves that we need to adjust, 5 exhaust and 5 intakes. The specs on this particular engine are intakes are 0.15 millimeters is the spec. That's the distance, the gap. And the exhaust is 0.40 millimeters. That's for a warm engine, and this one has been driven a little while today, so it's above 60 degrees, and so that's what we'll be adjusting there. So just in a moment, let's start taking some things off to get to those valves. Okay, the first thing we're going to take off is the air cleaner. There's a screw underneath the bottom here on the tube that leads from the air cleaner into the turbocharger, and down underneath there I usually use a 10 millimeter and a speed handle. It's just a lot easier to use for me than a screwdriver. I'll loosen that up some. First get that clamp loose, and then the next thing I'll take off is the top of the air cleaner. It's still a 10 millimeter. So I get that off, and then I always take this little tube off that goes to the front. We'll just set that aside there for a moment. And then there are 4 snap clamps, if you will. This little tube just comes right off. I usually just put it aside. Once I get those 4 clamps loose, I can just lift the breather cover right up. And you can see this air cleaner is brand new on this car. Take the air cleaner out. Once we get the air cleaner out, then we just need to remove those 3 10 millimeter nuts that are holding the breather assembly onto the top of the intake manifold there. I usually just leave those nuts right down in there. Take that off, and then the air cleaner ought to come right off. Now we want to remember, when we put this on, you see this little drain tube right here. Underneath this assembly there's a little drain tube, and it's got an O-ring on it, And if I forget to show you when we put that back on, you want to make sure that you get that seated back down in that drain tube right there when you put this assembly back together. It drains excess oil from that comes from the blow-by gases out of the top of the valve cover into this air cleaner assembly, and it drains it back down into the pan. But you'll have an oil leak if you don't do that. So we'll just set this thing aside. Okay, we need to take the top of this valve cover assembly off, and one of the very first things we need to do is to take the throttle linkage off. And what I mean is this bar that runs right along here. But in order to take that throttle linkage off, we need to disconnect a few of these little throttle rods, if you will. So they just snap right off of there if we're lucky. See, they're just a ball and socket joint. So we want to take that one off right there, and then we want to take this one off right here, and we want to take this one off right here. So we've got those three. And then on this assembly, let's see, let me make sure I get this right. We need to take off the one either way, here or here, because we're going to take this assembly off of here. So we'll take that one off and get it out of the way. And then this whole assembly is going to come off. I think that's all we need. Let's leave those for a moment. Now we need to take this little cotter pin out right there. I'll just set that there for a moment, and then
Where did that go? Where was that at?
That was right on the back of this throttle linkage right here. So it's right in the back, right there.
Okay.
There's a little hole. Now there's another one. If you can see where my finger is, there's another little clip, and this little clip is a little different clip assembly than that thing. You have to be careful. You lose that thing. So you take that little clip off. I'm just going to set it down there. Now this thing pushes forward, and as it pushes forward, you can see it disconnects from this part of the accelerator linkage right there. And then once we get it forward, we have to back it up a little bit, and then it comes out outside of the what we call the rack, the tubes that run diesel into the head. So we need to take that thing off, and as I just did. Now I'm going to set this on the workbench so I don't lose it. Now the next things we need to take off, I think, are 13 millimeters bolts. Yes, there are a couple of them that hold various things on. The first is these two bolts right here, holds this linkage on. We're going to take those off of there. But I think we can just leave that particular rod on there. Now there are two more on this side. If you get over, perhaps you can see them right here. There are two 13 millimeter bolts right here. They bolt this entire assembly. That's all part of the accelerator and control linkage for the transmission, some of it. We're going to take all of that off. And before we completely disassemble it, there's a little tab right there, and if we push it up, we could probably pull that plug out of there. Like that. So now I just set this aside, and actually I need a little clamp to go in there, but let's just set this over out of our way. The entire assembly, let's just set it aside. Now you can see I'm almost ready. Let me pull this. These lines are very typically they're hard plastic and they get brittle over time and they break very easily. So we just want to put that aside. Now you can see we're ready to take the valve cover off, and there are 4 bolts. One here, and then there's 2 on each side here, here, and then there's that one, and there's one right back here. And they're also 13 millimeter, and we want to take those off. And then the valve cover should be ready to come off. So loosen them all up first. Okay. Now we should be ready to pull this valve cover off. And you can see that there's one little tube that's stuck right here, one of these return tubes. You can see if you look very closely, it sticks down in a little slot right there on part of this linkage, and it was still stuck there. So I needed to remove that. Now, and that, of course, just comes right off. I had a hold of it, so I pulled it off accidentally. But sometimes this thing has to be in exactly the right position to come off of there, and sometimes it's a little stubborn. But you can see that it comes right off, and this one's a little warm. I'm going to have to set it down. Ready?
Yep.
What I always do before I start adjusting the valves is make a little diagram of the thing that we had earlier, where I just list each one of the valves, and I list them in order, and mostly I just want to have that so that every time I adjust one, I take a pencil and check it off. And the very first thing I do is look for valves where the lobe is not down. In other words, where the lobe is not touching the little thing that moves the valve back and forth. And it's easier perhaps to see from this side, Gordon, so if you swap sides with me, you can see. Let me get a little pointer too. So what we're looking for is the valves from the front of the engine, front to back. This is the very first valve, and that's an exhaust valve, and then it goes exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust, exhaust, intake, intake, exhaust, exhaust, intake. And you can see that there's a lobe on this camshaft, and when that lobe touches this piece right here, then that opens the valve. So the lobe pushes the valve open. So we want to get the adjustment between this camshaft and this piece that operates the valve, and we want the thousandths of millimeters to be in there. So that's the distance that we're talking about. So you can see that I can adjust this valve right now without turning the engine over, because the lobe is at the top, and so I got no risk that the lobe is interfering and pushing down at all. Let me find another one that's in a good position. That one right there, you see the lobe is right on top, so I could adjust that one. Similarly with that one. So I have to know which valve I'm adjusting, because the intakes and the exhausts are different. But all I'm going to do is adjust each one of those valves, and whenever the lobe is in the wrong position, that's when I'm going to use my little starter switch. And let me connect that right now just to show you how it connects. Right underneath my fender skirt, there are a set of wires on a 300D turbo or 300D or even 240D, and they come to a little terminal block. The front 2 wires are the ones that I want. By connecting those 2 wires together, I'm actually bumping the starter, and that'll enable me to turn the engine over remotely without having to go inside and bump it with the key. So I've just got a little switch with alligator clips on it, and there are 3 screws there, 3 connections, and the front 2 connections are the ones that I'm interested in, so that now when I hit this little trigger, I can bump that engine over when I need to get the valves into proper position for adjustment. So let's first take care of those valves that I said were on top. One of the very first valves that I can adjust, and I adjust these valves randomly, and that's one of the reasons that I make this diagram, because random is a lot faster. Randomly, I'll just find the ones that I can adjust without bumping the engine and go ahead and adjust them first. Now, the very first one I want to do is this one right here. So it goes exhaust is first and then 2 intakes. So that's an intake valve, and it adjusts at 0.15 millimeters. Now I don't have a 0.15 millimeter on my feeler gauge, so I had to take the combination of several in order to arrive arithmetically at 0.15. So all I want to do is stick that underneath there and see if it's got 15, and it does not. I can't get that feeler gauge under there, and that's what happens as the valves wear. As the engine wears, the valves get tight. And as the valves get tight, that's not good. They need to be adjusted about every 18,000 miles, but as they get tight, it diminishes the compression because the valve is open too long, and depending upon whether it's intake or exhaust, either way it affects the compression. So that happens to be an intake valve, and it's just too tight. I can't get my feeler gauge underneath there. So what I need to do is adjust it, and that's where my 2 wrenches come in. Okay, so I've got my 2 wrenches, and there are 2 nuts. One of them's a lock nut on the bottom. Let's call it cap nut is on top. The cap nut is used to adjust the valve, but the first thing I have to do is break the lock nut loose. So if I put my 2 wrenches on there, and you can see that I can break that nut loose. Now this valve was too tight. So what I need to do is the valve adjusts with that top nut, and so turning that top nut clockwise will adjust the valve. Now you can see that I'm going to have to simultaneously back off that bottom in order to adjust that top one. Now what I want to do is adjust them to the point where I can get my feeler gauge underneath there. It was 15.15 millimeters, so I need to back that cap nut off to the point where I can get my feeler gauge in there.
Okay.
Finally, I got that top cap nut loose enough. That was a pretty tight valve. Now I need 0.15 millimeter, and I finally got it loose enough to where I can get that feeler gauge underneath there. Now I want the feeler gauge to go in there, and I want it to be just where I can feel the friction. I've still got it just a little bit tight. I just barely want to feel enough friction in there so that the feeler gauge just barely touches. So I need it just a little bit more, and then I'll tighten it. So let's see where that is. There. That's just right. I can just feel that feeler gauge touching. So now I need to tighten that cap nut, keeping the top nut in the position that kept it adjusted. And now once I tighten them, I'll go back and make sure that that's right, and it is. Okay, so now I got that valve adjusted. Now while that cam is in that position, I want to look for any other valves that I can find where the lobe is not touching the valve. And as you recall, this one right here, you can see that lobe is right at the top. So I know that that one's very clear. So I'm going to adjust that one now. It happens to be an exhaust. I'd rather switch to the 0.40 millimeters now while that valve is there than to do all the intakes first. I'll just do intake, exhaust, whichever one ends up in the correct position. So now I need to find a 40 millimeter combination on my set here. Now I'll find 40 millimeter. No, before I forget, let me check off that valve. That was the 3rd one down. That was an intake valve that I adjusted. So now I've got it checked off. Now I'm going to go back and find 40 millimeter combination here. And let's see. There's 0.40 millimeter, I'm sorry. So there's the correct combination that I want. I want a 20, a 12, and an 8 to get 40. So this is an exhaust valve, and the exhaust adjusts at 40. So let's see where that exhaust valve is. Oh wow, that one's tight too. So same process, loosen the cap nut, the lock nut and the cap nut. So that was, let's see, which one? I was on this one, right? This one right here. Let me get this one. I do an intake and exhaust just to show the difference. Now I want to do 40 on this one, 40.40 millimeters. And now I've finally adjusted it to where it's a little bit too loose. So I'll back it back up there. Now, right there. Now hold this position, hold the top one in position, and turn the bottom one in such a way as to lock the top one. Now once I get it that way, I'll check it, and apparently I got it. Oops, no, that's the wrong one. That's my combination right there. Oops.
Okay.
Well, I got, okay, I got that a little out of adjustment, and let's see. Turning this top nut clockwise now loosens the valve. I had a little tight. Let's see if I get it close. No, it's still a little tight. Make sure I've still got my right combination here. 40. Okay, so I finally got that one loosened up enough, and you can see that feeler gauge just goes through there with a little bit of friction. So what I want to do is keep that top one in the right position and then adjust the bottom one, tighten up the bottom one, and that's fine. That's just right. Just a little bit of friction there, and so I've got that one adjusted. Now let's look for any others. Now what we'll do is we'll adjust every one that we can where the lobe is up off of the valve, and then we'll bump the engine. Now it so happens that I've got another one exhaust I'll adjust, but I'll bump the engine so that I can get the lobes to come up whenever I need to get to a valve that's not up, and then I'll check one off. Now I didn't check that last one I did off. It's the third one from the back. It's an exhaust valve. So now I've got two of them adjusted. We just keep doing them back and forth, bumping the engine, and I'll show you what that engine bumping over looks like. We'll just do that right now to get a valve in a right position. You can see that if I just do that a little bit, I can adjust, I can move those valves around and just adjust whichever one is up on top. We just finished bumping the engine over and checking all the valves, and then you can see I've checked them all off. I double checked them to make sure that I had each one. So now I know that I didn't forget one. I've adjusted them all, and so now we're ready to put the valve cover back on and reassemble this whole thing. Doesn't take very long. The only tricky part is just getting that cover just right, so that it has to be in the right position to fall down over that assembly. But first, okay, so we've got the valve cover over here on the workbench, and it's real simple to put this new gasket on there. It just Mercedes makes such quality gaskets. We don't use any Permatex or any sealer on this thing. It'll seal without that stuff, and for the next time we take it off, we don't want to have that Permatex on there. So it fits very nicely. As I say, it's really a nice quality gasket that Mercedes makes. The German cars have. So you just fit that gasket down all the way around. It fits very nice and snug, so that when you're putting this thing on, it typically won't come off. It'll typically just stay there because of its tight fit. So okay, so now we've got this gasket pushed down over this valve cover. We want to make sure it doesn't slip, and we very carefully want to put this down in place. Now the timing chain is typically the thing that we have to get by, and this tube right here that's right on top of the camshaft. So as I recall, it wants to be tilted a little bit this way, and we have to play with it a little bit to get it on there correctly. nuts coming off here, so I have to be careful. There. And once it starts, I want to make sure the gasket is on, and it is. Now, once it goes down, it's pretty straightforward. I just want to make sure that gasket didn't come up in any place. I believe I've got it sealed on there. Okay, so you can see that it won't rock. Once it sets on there, it's real smooth. And the bolts are just sticking above valve cover a little bit, so I'm just going to put those 4 nuts on there and cinch it down a little bit. Okay, now I want to tighten these nuts down. I don't want to tighten them too tight. I usually tighten them kind of kitty corner. I've got 4 bolts, so I tighten the front one and then one of the back ones, the one on the other side, until I can start to feel it get a little tight, and then back and forth. Kind of rotate between these 4 bolts. So I'm going to cinch this thing down, but I'll be careful not to break it. I could literally put enough force on it, I'm sure, to crack that valve cover, and I don't want to do that. So you can see that I'm tightening it with a ratchet, a 3/8 ratchet about that big, and I could easily twist those nuts off of there. So just want to go back and forth until it just feels snug. And there, I've got it. Now if you recall, this assembly comes back and comes right back up there, goes right back in place. And first, these 2 nuts will go on. These 2 bolts, I'm sorry. So there's 2 bolts that go in this assembly. Attach it to the valve cover. Sometimes those things are a little hard to get started. Now as we assemble this back, this little bracket goes on top. So it goes on top, and I've got 2 bolts that I need to put in there. And I've got several things to align, so that could be a little tricky. Got it. Okay, got all those started. Now you remember the assembly of this linkage. It goes underneath. You see, it's going to attach to this thing. It goes underneath the second tube from the back. Put it under there, and we put it all the way to the back, and get it on over near the oil filter assembly over here. And you can see that there's a little hole that the rod slips through right there. Slip it through there, put it in the back, and slip it back. Now we want 2 keepers. The back keeper is fairly straightforward. Let's leave that front keeper till the last. You know, the easiest thing I found is just to take a pair of needle nose like that and push it through that little hole. I say it's easy, and watch. Okay, so I clipped that right on there. Now these clips, these kinds of clips, sometimes they're real easy to drop. And if you drop this one, it's going to go down in that assembly. And it might stay in the assembly somewhere in the engine, and it's going to be really, really hard to find. What I've found over the years is sometimes if you do that and you lose a little clip and you can't see it up there, if you take some compressed air, if you've got a compressor at all on a little blowgun, and just try to blow it loose if it's stuck underneath the hood, underneath in the engine assembly somewhere, and sometimes you can use forced air to blow it loose. Or if you've got a little magnet on the end of one of those little telescoping poles, sometimes that works. But sometimes I just try to hold this thing just so I don't lose it. What I want to do is put it on the end of there, and this one is particularly problematic as I recall. You just have to be really careful. I don't want to drop that thing because I don't want you have to use compressed air to find it if I can help it. There. Got it on there, and of course when it goes on there it twists around. And it's pretty straightforward the way it goes on there. Now one of the last things I have to do, well first I gotta put this little assembly on there. If you recall, these are the lines that get brittle and crack, but it just plugs right there. And sometimes I have to move that little catch up a little bit. There, plug that in. Now I've got that line to attach. I'll attach that in a moment. There's some little clips that clip that to the rack, as you recall. So I got that clipped back. Now one of the last things I have to do is attach the throttle linkage, and it's all pretty straightforward, but it's pretty important on these engines to keep this throttle linkage well lubricated. And what I always do is just use grease. I keep a little can of grease with a brush, and what I do is just make sure that I put lots of grease inside the ball joint, and I usually grease up the actual ball itself. So these joints have to be all greased up. Now usually what I do to put them back together, and I'll have to go over there to my toolbox and get a set of pliers, but I usually just mash them back together with a pair of pliers. That's what I've always found works the best. Just a big pair of channel locks works real well for me. So I've got about 4 or 5 of these things that I've got disassembled here. That one just snapped right on there. I didn't even need pliers, but let me get a pair of channel locks. So I say, what I do is just take a pair of channel locks and just snap them back together. You can feel them as they go back. It's real easy to feel them snap back together. Sometimes you can even hear them. Now, I think I've got them all connected back. You see, I do. You see all the throttle linkage is reassembled, and the only thing I think we have left to do is put the valve cover system, or the air breather back on there. I've got that one little tube that I have to put on the emission control system right there. Poor thing, yeah. You remember we had a little tube right here, and it pushed down in a little groove right there. It's one of those return tubes on the injector system, and we want to make sure that that thing is kept out of the way of the throttle linkage, and it is. But it just slips back in place right down there, so we got that. And then, as you recall, I said don't forget to put that O-ring back down on that drain tube. The way I assemble this thing is stick it in there and put it in its approximate position, and then I put the cut for a moment. Oh, there it is. Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
So the first thing is to get the tube over the turbocharger. So I put the air cleaner in a position to, first of all, put that on there. And then the next thing before these 3 screws line up is just put your left hand on the back right here and feel that drain tube and make sure that the air breather goes right over the top of that drain tube, and then it slips down over the top of the 3 bolts that mount it. And then we're just going to put the nuts on and reassemble the breather as it was. Okay, so I got the air cleaner back on and got it all back reassembled. About the only thing left to do once you get the valves adjusted is just to make sure you got to start the engine up and check all around the valve cover gasket to make sure it's not seeping oil. Make sure you got it seated right and it's all tight, and make sure you got everything reassembled correctly. But we'll start this one up and make sure it doesn't have any oil leaks, but otherwise we're finished. We're supposed to do that every 18,000 miles. If I didn't say that, that's what the book calls for, 18,000. So for me, that's about a year and a half's worth of driving. I don't know what that is for you, but usually if you do it every 18,000 miles, they're just out of adjustment just a little bit, and they typically tighten up as they wear. So you might find them a little tight every time you adjust them. Last thing, I forgot to mention, changed my board here. For a cold engine, if you work on the engine when it's cold, the valve adjustment is slightly smaller. As you recall, metal expands when it gets hot. So the hot engine has a little wider gaps than the cold engine. The cold engine has a 0.10 millimeters on the intake and 0.35 millimeters on the exhaust when it's cold. And the cold engine, according to the book, is a 20 degrees C or less. So 20 degrees C is probably about 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I can't remember exactly what it is, but that's an engine that's not been started or run anytime lately.